My greedy family fought over scraps, laughing when Grandma Alara left me only her run-down shack. They called it worthless, but Grandma's final legacy was a secret far greater than any of them could imagine. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. My Aunt Carol sat across from me, dabbing at her dry eyes with a pristine lace handkerchief. A performance for an audience of one. The balding, weary-looking Mr. Abernathy. My cousin Mark, her son, was slouched in the chair beside her, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression, the picture of filial devotion. They were here for the spoils. I was just here because Grandma Alara had insisted. "And to my daughter, Carol," Mr. Abernathy read, his voice a dry rustle. "I leave my portfolio of stocks and the contents of my safety deposit box." Aunt Carol let out a small theatrical sob that sounded more like a sigh of relief. A surgical smirk played on Mark's lips. That was the main event. Grandma didn't have much, but my aunt, who hadn't visited her in 5 years, had just inherited the only liquid assets she possessed. "To my grandson, Mark," the lawyer continued, "I leave my 2012 Buick, with the hope he uses it to finally visit somewhere other than the mall." Mark snorted, pocketing his phone. A free car was a free car. Then Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses and looked at me over the rims. A flicker of something pity, perhaps, crossed his face. "And to my beloved grandson, Alex," he read, and my heart gave a painful little squeeze at the word beloved. "To the only one who ever truly listened to my stories, I leave my home and all its contents, located at 14 Whisperwind Lane." Silence. Aunt Carol's performative grief vanished, replaced by a look of utter disdain. Mark actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "The shack?" he sneered. "She left you the shack? Good luck with the demolition costs, cousin." My aunt leaned forward, her voice a venomous whisper. "Frankly, Alex, she's done you a disservice. That place is a money pit. It's practically condemned. The property taxes alone will bleed you dry. She should have just sold it and split the money." But she hadn't, because Grandma Alara wasn't practical. She was a dreamer, a weaver of fantastical tales. She'd spent her life telling me stories of adventure, of hidden treasures and forgotten histories. Our family called her eccentric. I called her magical. She raised me after my parents passed, and that little house, that shack, was the only real home I'd ever known. But Mark was right. The last time I'd seen it, years ago, it was already surrendering to the relentless grip of nature. The drive out to Whisperwind Lane felt like a journey back in time. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track barely wide enough for my beat-up sedan. The trees grew thick and low, their branches knitting together overhead, plunging the lane into a perpetual twilight. And then I saw it. The word shack was generous. It was more like the carcass of a house. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. The porch steps groaned in protest as I ascended, and the paint, once a cheerful yellow, was peeling off in long, sun-bleached strips. A jungle of weeds and thorny bushes had consumed the yard, their tendrils crawling up the walls as if trying to drag the whole structure back into the earth. It smelled of damp earth, rotting wood, and a faint, ghostly scent of the cinnamon and lavender potpourri Grandma always kept by the door. My heart sank. This wasn't a home. It was a burden, an anchor of debt and decay tied to my leg. Aunt Carol's words echoed in my ears. I'd have to sell the land, probably at a loss, just to pay for the demolition. I pushed the warped wooden door open. It shrieked on its hinges, a sound of pure agony. The inside was a time capsule of gentle neglect. A thick layer of dust covered everything, turning the familiar floral patterns of the furniture into muted, ghostly shapes. Motes of dust danced like fairies in the slivers of sunlight that pierced through the grimy windows. It was smaller than I remembered, cluttered with a lifetime of mismatched furniture, stacks of books, and peculiar knickknacks Grandma had collected. I spent the first day just breathing it in, remembering. There was the armchair where she'd sit and tell me stories of being a spy in a foreign land. There was the wobbly kitchen table where she taught me to bake her famous apple crumble. Every object whispered a memory. Despite the decay, it felt more like home than my sterile, rented apartment ever had. Defeated but determined, I decided to at least start clearing the place out. Maybe I could salvage some of the furniture. I started in the main living area with the largest, most imposing piece, a massive dark oak armoire that stood against the far wall. It was an ancient Gothic-looking thing, carved with intricate patterns of vines and birds. Grandma had loved this piece. "It holds all my secrets, Alex," she used to say, winking at me as she polished its dark wood with a lavender-scented cloth. It was too heavy to move alone, but I had to clean behind it. I put my shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. It scraped against the old wooden floorboards with a deafening groan. I pushed again, putting my entire body weight into it. The armoire shifted a few more inches, and then I heard it. It wasn't the sound of wood on wood. It was a soft, mechanical click. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I held my breath, listening to the profound silence of the old house. I must have imagined it. I braced myself and pushed one more time with all my might. Clunk. This time, it was unmistakable. It was a solid metallic sound like a bolt sliding home, and it came from directly underneath the armoire. I stopped pushing, my mind racing. What was that? I crouched down, peering into the dusty darkness beneath the heavy piece of furniture. The floorboards were old, wide planks of dark, worn wood. But where the front leg of the armoire had just been, something was different. The seam between two of the planks seemed wider, darker. My fingers, trembling, brushed away a century of dust. And there, etched into the dark wood of the floorboard, hidden from view for who knows how long, was a single, perfect, impossible keyhole. A keyhole. My mind reeled, trying to process it. It was impossible. I'd lived in this house for years as a kid. I'd run, slid, and played on every square inch of this floor. It had never been there. It couldn't have been. But there it was, a dark little secret staring up at me from the wood. Grandma Ilara, you magnificent, crazy old woman. Her wink, her cryptic phrase about the armoire holding her secrets. It wasn't just a quirky saying. It was a clue. The armoire wasn't the secret. It was the guardian. It was the lock on the lock. A frantic energy seized me. A key. I needed a key. Where would a woman who hides a keyhole under a half-ton piece of furniture hide the key? I scrambled to my feet, dust motes swirling around me like frantic ghosts. My eyes darted around the room, seeing it not as a collection of dilapidated memories, but as a puzzle box. Every object was a potential clue, every book a possible hiding place. I started with the obvious places. The chipped ceramic pot on the mantelpiece that held a collection of mismatched buttons and old coins. I plunged my hand in, the cool, smooth objects clicking against my fingernails. Nothing. I checked the drawers of the rickety writing desk in the corner, sifting through dried-up pens, faded postcards, and bundles of old letters tied with ribbon. Nothing. I even patted down the cushions of the lumpy armchair, my fingers probing the dusty crevices for the telltale lump of cold metal. Still nothing. Hours bled into one another. The slivers of sunlight creeping through the windows stretched long, then faded into a dusty orange glow. My initial frantic energy soured into a grim, obsessive determination. I went through the kitchen, checking every tea tin and flour canister. I climbed the creaking stairs to her bedroom, the air upstairs even more still and heavy. I gently opened her small mother-of-pearl jewelry box, finding only a few silver chains and a single, sad-looking earring. I checked under the mattress, inside her old leather boots in the closet, even in the pockets of the faded floral dress that still hung on the back of the door, holding the faint shape of her body. My hope began to curdle into the familiar taste of disappointment. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Mark and Aunt Carol were right. This was just a shack filled with junk, and I was just a fool chasing the ghosts of my grandmother's stories. I slumped down on the edge of her bed, burying my face in my hands. The room smelled of her lavender and old books. Old books! My head snapped up. The walls of her bedroom weren't painted. They were lined with bookshelves crammed with novels of every description: fantasy, history, adventure, mystery. She wasn't just a reader. She was a devourer of stories. The best treasures are hidden within stories, Alex. She'd told me 1,000 times. I had always assumed she meant life lessons, morals. What if she meant it literally? I stood up and ran my fingers along the spines. The Count of Monte Cristo, Treasure Island, Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was an impossible task. There were hundreds of them. How could I possibly know which one? I started pulling them from the shelves one by one, shaking them, flipping through the pages, my heart sinking with each empty volume. Dust filled the air, making me sneeze. The pile of discarded books on the floor grew into a small mountain. It was hopeless. Just as I was about to give up, my hand brushed against a book that felt different. It wasn't a grand, leather-bound classic. It was a small, simple book with a faded blue cover, tucked away in the corner of the lowest shelf. It had no title on the spine. I pulled it out. The cover was worn smooth, especially at the corners, as if it had been held and handled 1,000,000 times. It was a book of local folklore and legends, filled with hand-drawn maps of the surrounding woods and tales of smugglers' tunnels and hidden gold. It was her favorite. She read from it every night before I went to sleep. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. I thumbed through it, expecting a key to fall out, but nothing happened. I reached the very center of the book, a chapter on the Whispering Caverns. And then I saw it. The pages weren't flat. There was a subtle thickness, a slight bulge. I ran my thumb over the illustration of a cave entrance, and the paper felt wrong. It was too stiff. Using my fingernail, I carefully pried at the edge of the illustration. A section of the page, perfectly cut around the drawing, lifted up. My breath caught in my throat. Beneath it, nestled in a precisely carved-out hollow in the pages, lay a key. It was unlike any key I'd ever seen. It wasn't brass or steel. It was made of a dark, almost black metal, heavy in my palm. The head was shaped like a bird with its wings unfurled, and the bit was a complex, swirling pattern that looked more like a piece of art than a functional tool. Clutching the key so tightly my knuckles turned white, I clattered back down the stairs. The last rays of sunlight were dying, painting the living room in long, eerie shadows. The armoire stood like a silent sentinel, guarding its secret. I dropped to my knees before the hidden keyhole, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The air was thick with anticipation. With a shaky hand, I brought the bird-shaped key to the floorboard. It slid into the hidden lock with a smooth, satisfying click, as if it had been waiting a lifetime to come home. I took a deep breath, gripped the bird's wings, and turned. There was a deep, resonant thunk from beneath the floor, a sound that seemed to vibrate up through my bones. It was followed by a series of quiet, whirring clicks, like the gears of an ancient clockwork machine waking from a long slumber. Then, with a soft hiss of displaced air, the entire section of the floor I was kneeling on, a perfect 3-foot square, popped up by an inch, breaking a seal of dust and time. It wasn't just a loose floorboard. It was a hatch, a trapdoor, and leading down from it into a pitch-black, silent void was the top of a steep stone staircase. The air that wafted up from the opening was ancient. It was a cold subterranean breath that smelled of damp stone, deep earth, and something else. Something metallic and clean, a sterile scent that was completely alien to the musty decay of the shack above. My phone's flashlight cut a nervous, trembling beam into the inky blackness, revealing the top few steps. They weren't wood like the rest of the house, but solid, roughly hewn stone, slick with a thin film of moisture. They descended at a steep angle into a void that swallowed the light completely. For a moment, I was paralyzed. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the hatch shut, push the armoire back into place, and run. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some quaint little cellar for storing preserves. This was something else entirely. Grandma Alara's stories flooded my mind tales of forgotten smugglers' routes that crisscrossed the coastline, of hidden bunkers from forgotten wars. I'd always thought they were just stories, fanciful tales spun to entertain a lonely boy. Now, standing on the precipice of this impossible discovery, I wasn't so sure. Was this what she meant when she said she'd been a spy? My curiosity, a trait I'd inherited directly from her, warred with my fear. It was a short, brutal battle. With my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I swung my legs over the edge and planted my feet on the first stone step. It was cold and solid beneath my worn sneakers. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm my nerves, I started my descent. The staircase was narrow and winding, spiraling down into the earth. The walls were rough-hewn stone on one side and packed earth on the other, held back by ancient-looking wooden beams. Tree roots, pale and ghostly white, snaked through the dirt like bony fingers. My flashlight beam danced ahead of me, revealing nothing but the next few steps and the oppressive darkness beyond. The air grew colder with every step, and the sounds of the world above, the creak of the old house, the whisper of the wind faded away, replaced by a profound tomb-like silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the scuff of my shoes on stone. I must have gone down 30, maybe 40 feet when the staircase finally ended. It opened into a small, circular chamber, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The floor and walls were lined with the same dark, damp stone. For a heart-stopping second, I thought this was it. A dead end. A bizarre, pointless folly built by an eccentric old woman. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over me. I swept my flashlight beam around the small space, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a dead end. Set into the far wall was a door. But what a door! It wasn't wood or stone. It was a seamless slab of brushed steel, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. In the center, instead of a handle, was a large circular wheel, like on a submarine hatch. It looked utterly, technologically out of place. A piece of the 21st century buried in a tomb from the 19th. My bewilderment was absolute. How? How did this get here? Who built this? The logistics of excavating this space and installing a vault door without anyone in the tiny, gossipy nearby town knowing were mind-boggling. A small rectangular panel was set into the wall next to the wheel. I moved closer, my light trembling. It was a keypad, a simple 10-digit numeric pad, dark and inert. No brand name, no markings, just the numbers. My hope deflated as quickly as it had surged. A combination lock. Of course, it could be anything. A birthday, an anniversary, a random string of numbers she'd thought up. I could spend a lifetime down here guessing and never find it. I slumped against the cold stone wall, the beam of my flashlight playing over the cold steel of the vault door. I thought of Grandma Alara. What was she hiding? What secret was so important it required this level of protection? My gaze fell back to the keypad. My mind raced through significant dates. Her birthday? My birthday? The date my parents died? I tried them all. The keypad remained stubbornly dead. Nothing. No beep, no flash of light. Frustration gnawed at me. I felt like a character in one of her adventure novels, stuck on a riddle with the treasure just out of reach. I pushed myself off the wall and ran my hand over the cool metal of the door, as if I could somehow divine its secrets through touch. My fingers traced the outline of the wheel, then moved to the keypad. I pressed a few random numbers again. Nothing. It was probably dead, the battery having given up the ghost years ago. Dejected, I prepared to leave. I shone my light one last time around the small chamber, a final futile search for another clue. My beam traced the floor, the walls, the ceiling, and then it caught on something near the keypad I hadn't noticed before. Etched into the stone, almost invisible unless the light hit it at the perfect angle, were a series of tiny, faint markings. I leaned in, my nose almost touching the cold rock. They weren't letters or numbers. They were small, simple symbols: a bird, a key, a book, and a compass, rose with the west point heavily emphasized. The bird and the key. I understood the key I held was shaped like a bird. The book of folklore where I found the key. But what did the compass mean? I pulled the heavy bird-shaped key from my pocket. It felt cool and solid in my hand. I looked at the symbols again. Bird, key, book, west. An idea, insane and improbable, sparked in my mind. It couldn't be that simple, could it? I looked back at the book in my memory. The chapter I'd found the key in was called The Whispering Caverns. I remembered the hand-drawn map in that chapter. It was a map of the local coastline, detailing caves that were supposedly used by smugglers. I scrambled back up the stone steps, my lungs burning, my mind buzzing. Bursting back into the dusty living room, I snatched the book from the pile on the floor and flipped frantically to the right page. There was the map, and there, marked on the westernmost point of the coastline on the map, next to the drawing of the Whispering Caverns, was a number. It wasn't a page number or a coordinate. It was just a number written in my grandmother's spidery handwriting, 8419. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I stumbled back to the hole in the floor, nearly tripping down the stairs in my haste. I stood before the keypad, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely aim them. I took a shaky breath and pressed the digits. 8. A tiny red light above the pad blinked once. My breath hitched. It was working. 4. The light blinked again. 1. Blink. 9. This time, there was no blink. Instead, a soft electronic chime echoed in the small chamber, a sound so clear and modern it felt like sacrilege. It was followed by a loud, satisfying clunk from deep within the steel door. The large wheel in the center moved a quarter of an inch on its own, a silent invitation. It wasn't locked anymore. My hand, slick with sweat, gripped the cold steel wheel. It turned with surprising ease. I pulled, and the heavy vault door swung open without a sound, revealing the darkness within. A new scent hit me, overriding the damp earth. The crisp, clean smell of circulated air and ozone, the scent of money. I pointed my phone's flashlight into the room, and the beam was swallowed not by darkness, but by a blinding, shimmering, impossible ocean of gold. It wasn't an ocean. It was a mountain range. My flashlight beam, which had seemed so powerful in the narrow stone passage, was a pathetic little firefly against the sheer scale of what lay before me. The room wasn't large, maybe 15 feet square, but it was filled, almost to the ceiling, with stacks of gold bars. They weren't the polished, perfectly rectangular bricks you see in movies. These were older, slightly rougher, stamped with different crests and hallmarks I didn't recognize. They gleamed with a deep, buttery yellow light, absorbing my flashlight beam and throwing it back 100-fold, making the entire room shimmer with a warm, hypnotic glow. I took a stumbling step forward, my legs feeling like they were made of cotton. The air in the vault was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the damp chill of the tunnel. My sneakers were silent on the smooth, polished concrete floor. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the nearest stack. The bar was cold, impossibly heavy, and felt real. So unbelievably, terrifyingly real. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a dream. This was my grandmother's secret, My mind, already reeling, simply shut down. I couldn't process the how or the why. All I could do was stare, my mouth hanging open, as my brain tried to calculate the value of what I was seeing. It was a futile exercise. The numbers were too big, too abstract. It was more money than my family had seen in 10 generations combined. It was life-changing, world-altering, reality-breaking wealth. And Grandma Ilara, my sweet, eccentric grandma who baked apple crumble and mended my ripped jeans, had been sitting on top of it my entire life. Slowly, as the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a dizzying vertigo, I started to explore the small space. Tucked away in a corner behind a particularly tall stack of gold was a sturdy metal desk and a chair. It was a simple, functional setup, like something from a military surplus store. On the desk, illuminated by the sweep of my flashlight, sat 3 objects: a thick, leather-bound ledger, an old-fashioned rotary telephone, and a single, framed photograph. I picked up the photograph first. It was a black-and-white image of a woman I barely recognized. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a confident smile that hinted at a deep well of mischief. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested the 1950s or early 60s. She was wearing a trench coat and standing on a foggy bridge somewhere in Europe, a famous landmark I couldn't quite place looming in the background. It was my grandmother. It was Ilara, but a version of her I had never known, a world away from the soft, wrinkled woman who smelled of cinnamon and lavender. This woman looked like she could dismantle a government with a well-placed whisper. She looked like a spy. My hand was shaking as I set the photo down and reached for the ledger. The leather was worn smooth with use. I opened it to the first page. The entries were written in my grandmother's elegant, looping cursive, but the content was chillingly precise. It wasn't a diary, it was a transaction log. Dates, names I didn't recognize, coded references to locations, and figures, massive figures. It started in 1961. The entries were sporadic at first, then became more frequent. Asset recovery, Berlin. Acquisition, Cairo. Client payment, Zurich. I flipped through the pages, a secret history of the Cold War unfolding before my eyes. My grandmother wasn't just a spy, it seemed she was some sort of ghost operative. A financial shadow, moving stolen assets and recovering plundered treasures for governments or powerful individuals who couldn't officially acknowledge their loss. The gold stacked around me wasn't a single treasure, it was a commission, a lifetime of payments for services rendered in the shadows. This vault wasn't just a hiding place, it was her bank, her retirement fund. I sank into the cold metal chair, my head spinning. The woman who taught me to tie my shoes had toppled regimes and hunted Nazi gold. It was too much. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest. Aunt Carol and Mark had scoffed at the rundown shack. They had no idea. They were fighting over the scraps from the table, completely oblivious to the feast hidden in the cellar. My flashlight beam drifted from the ledger to the third object on the desk, the black rotary telephone. It looked ancient, a relic from another era, but unlike everything else in the shack above, it was pristine. Not a speck of dust on it. A single thick black cable ran from its base into a conduit in the wall. On a whim, driven by a surreal sense of detachment, I picked up the heavy bakelite receiver. I expected silence. I expected a deadline. Instead, I was met with a low, clear, unmistakable dial tone. My blood ran cold. The phone was active. After all these years, buried 40 feet underground, this impossible telephone line was still live. It was a direct line, no doubt. But to whom? My thumb hovered over the rotary dial, the smooth plastic cool against my skin. Who would be on the other end? An old contact of hers? A government agency? Some clandestine organization that had been waiting decades for this phone to be picked up? My grandmother had left me her home and all its contents. Did that include her secrets? Her work? Her enemies? The weight of it all pressed down on me. This was more than just money. This was a legacy, a dangerous, complicated legacy. Taking the gold was one thing. Making this call was another. It was crossing a line, stepping out of my simple, quiet life and into the shadowy world she had inhabited. It was acknowledging that the stories weren't just stories. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm in the silence of the vault. I thought about my dead-end job, my cramped apartment, my mountain of student debt. I thought about the freedom this gold represented. Then I thought about the woman in the photograph, the one with the mischievous, intelligent eyes. She hadn't left me a note, no grand explanation. She had just left me the puzzle, the key, and the choice. She trusted me to figure it out. She trusted me to be brave enough. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I made my decision. I wasn't just going to take the gold. I was going to understand it. I was going to understand her. My thumb moved to the rotary dial. I remembered the numbers she had scrawled next to the map in the folklore book, 8419. It wasn't just the code for the keypad. She was a woman who believed in efficiency, in patterns. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. My finger hooked into the hole for the number 8. I pulled it around. The whirring of the rotary dial sounded deafeningly loud in the confined space. Then the 4, whir, the 1, whir, the 9, whir, then silence. I held the receiver to my ear, my entire body tense. For a long second, there was nothing but the faint hum of the open line. Then, just as I was about to hang up, there was a single, distant click. The line connected. A voice, old and raspy with disuse, crackled to life on the other end, speaking a single cryptic phrase in what sounded like German. Der Vogel ist aus dem Käfig, it said. The bird is out of the cage. The bird is out of the cage. The German words hung in the sterile air of the vault, a ghostly echo from a world I couldn't comprehend. My mind raced, trying to translate the phrase my grandmother had forced me to learn as a child, claiming it was just a fun game. It was never a game. I cleared my throat, my own voice sounding small and foreign. Der Käfig war nie verschlossen, I replied, the response coming to me as if by instinct. The cage was never locked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound I could hear the faint crackle of ancient wiring. Then the raspy voice spoke again, this time in perfect, unaccented English. Ilara? No, I said, my voice trembling slightly. She's gone. This is her grandson, Alex. Another pause, this one filled with a different kind of weight. Sadness, perhaps. I see, the voice said, the raspiness softening into something that sounded like genuine regret. She always said you were the clever one, said you listened to the stories. My condolences, Alex. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Who is this? I demanded, a surge of adrenaline sharpening my voice. My name is Conrad, he said simply. I was your grandmother's colleague and her executor of a sort. The fact that you are calling this number means you have passed her test. Welcome to the rest of your life. Over the next hour, Conrad explained everything. He and my grandmother were part of a small, unofficial organization formed after World War II, a group of librarians, as he called them. Their job was to recover items that had been lost, stolen, or hidden during the chaos of the war and the subsequent Cold War. Not just gold, but art, historical artifacts, and sensitive intelligence. They operated in the gray spaces between governments, accountable to no one but their own code of ethics. The gold in the vault was Ilara's accumulated fee over a 40-year career, a retirement she had carefully built for herself, and now, for me. The gold is yours, Alex, Conrad explained, clean, untraceable. Ilara set up the necessary accounts decades ago, but her legacy, that is something different. That phone is a link to our network. If you hang it up and walk away, no one will ever bother you. The line will go dead forever. But if you choose to stay on, well, the librarians always have need of a new apprentice. He gave me a number for a bank in Switzerland and a series of code words. He told me to take a week to think, and then, if I was interested, to call him back. Then he hung up. I sat there in the silence, the dial tone humming a monotonous, life-altering question in my ear. I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The vault, which moments ago had felt like a treasure chest, now felt like a crossroads. The next few days were a blur. I hired a local crew under the guise of assessing the shack for demolition, using a small part of the emergency cash I found in a lockbox on the desk to pay them. While they worked noisily above, I spent my time below, meticulously cataloging the contents of the vault. I moved a few of the gold bars into specially designed, discreet luggage I found in a hidden compartment in the desk. It was back-breaking work, but every ounce I moved felt like a step into a new reality. A week later, I drove to the city and met with a representative from the Swiss bank Conrad mentioned. The meeting was surreal, conducted in a sterile, anonymous office with a man who never gave his name. My grandmother's code words worked like a magic spell. Accounts were activated, and numbers that I could barely comprehend flashed across a computer screen. By the time I walked out, I was, for all intents and purposes, a multi-millionaire. My first act was not to buy a sports car or a mansion. It was to call my Aunt Carol. I met her and Mark at a fancy restaurant she would never have chosen herself. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Alex, dear," she began, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. "We've been worried. Have you decided what to do about that dreadful shack? Mark found a demolition company that will give you a reasonable rate." "I'm not demolishing it," I said, taking a sip of water. "I'm restoring it." Mark snorted. "With what? Good intentions? That place is a teardown." I slid a check across the table. It was for $200,000. "I'm also buying out your share of the Buick, Mark. And this," I said to Carol, "is for you. A thank you for all the years you checked in on Grandma." Their jaws dropped. They stared at the check, then at me, their faces a comical mask of shock and greed. "Where? How did you get this?" Carol stammered. "Grandma left me the house and all its contents," I said, echoing the lawyer's words. "Turns out some of her old junk was more valuable than we thought. Antiques, you know." The lie was simple, believable. It gave them an explanation they could swallow, one that didn't involve secret vaults and Cold War spies. It also subtly twisted the knife. The junk they had dismissed, the home they had disdained, had held a secret fortune they had been too blind to see. Their expressions soured as the realization hit them. They had sneered at the winning lottery ticket while fighting over pocket change. It was a petty satisfaction, but a deeply gratifying one. I spent the next year bringing the shack back to life. I hired the best architects and builders, people who specialized in historical restorations. We lifted the house, poured a new foundation, and replaced every rotten plank and broken window. We restored it not just to its former state, but to the idealized version that had existed in my memories. The porch was strong, the paint was a cheerful yellow, and the scent of cinnamon and lavender once again filled the air. The armoire was polished until it shone, and it stood proudly against the wall, its secret secure beneath the newly refinished floorboards. The vault remained my secret. I learned how to slowly, carefully liquidate small portions of the gold, transforming it from a static treasure into a tool. I started a foundation in my grandmother's name, funding scholarships for history students and grants for historical preservation projects. I was honoring her memory in a way that felt right, but the question of the black telephone lingered. I had the money. I had security. I could have lived a quiet, comfortable life. But every time I looked at that photograph of the young, fearless Alara, I felt a pull towards the stories. One crisp autumn evening, a year after I first found the vault, I descended the stone steps for what felt like the 100th time. The restored shack above me was warm and filled with light, a proper home now. But this place, this cold, secret heart beneath it, was my inheritance. I sat at the metal desk, picked up the receiver, and dialed. Conrad answered on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call, Alex," he said, his voice warm. "The bird is ready to learn to fly," I said, the words feeling both terrifying and right. A low chuckle came through the line. "Excellent. Your grandmother would be proud. We have a situation in Lisbon, a certain lost painting by Vermeer." As I listened, a sense of calm settled over me. Grandma Alara hadn't just left me a fortune. She had left me a key, a map, and a choice. A choice to remain the boy who listened to her stories, or to become the man who lived them. And as I sat there, 40 feet beneath my quiet, restored home, with a fortune at my back and a world of secrets opening up before me, I finally understood. The greatest treasure she left me wasn't the gold, it was her legacy,